When I was a kid, my family didn't really do the big name video game consoles. Instead, we had these plug-and-play consoles with an assortment of classic video games. So despite growing up in the 2000s, the games I played when I was young were from the 1980s. We had Miss Pac-Man, Pole Position, Frogger, and more. However, there is one game that I remember more than all the others. That game is Xevious. In Xevious, you play as an experimental fighter jet battling aliens in a vertically scrolling shooter. Most other shooter games coming out in the late 70s and early 80s were set in space. That meant a black background with stars, which is a somewhat boring backdrop, even if the gameplay is interesting. Although Xevious might not look like much today, it was ahead of its time. Instead of the empty void of space, the battles in Xevious take place above a lush patchwork of forests, plains, and country roads. I played many hours of this game as a kid. I don't think I was that great at it, but I did manage a few times to get past the first boss. Personally, I wanted to get as far as I could in the game, not because I wanted to beat the game, but because I just wanted to see what areas came next. There was always a fascinating mystery with what lay beyond. After the first boss battle, for example, I found a vast ocean that seemed to stretch on forever, although that was mostly because I kept dying there. Honestly, I'm not sure if I ever found out what was beyond it. One thing about Xevious is just how devious it is. It lives up to its quarter-eating arcade origins by spiking in difficulty the longer you stay alive. And the more points you get during a life, the harder the game gets. If you destroy all the regular alien ships in the first area, it will suddenly send a rain of super fast, near unavoidable enemies in your direction. This means that depending on how well you play the game, it's different each time you play. As a kid, this added to the mystery and replayability of the game, even if now, understanding how it works, it's quite a simple and slightly cynical way to design an arcade game. Now, the story of Xevious isn't explained within the game. It goes straight into the airborne combat and skips over any formalities like cutscenes or Star Wars style scrolling text. All you get when you start the game is the announcement that you have 2 Solvalu left. What is a Solvalu? Well, it's the name of the ship you're piloting. I think it also intentionally sounds like something that would emerge from the depths of the Soviet space program. Also, I've now heard people pronounce it both Solvalu and Solvalu, so who knows how you're supposed to say it. Apparently, in addition to not having any opening cutscenes or introduction, the original Xevious doesn't even have a victory screen. If you get to the end of the game, it just loops back to the start. So for lore, we'll have to dive into the manuals and game guides that were created for the game. So what is the story of Xevious? Well, it's a bit more interesting than I expected. The Xevious people, sometimes referred to as Xevions, were a group that inhabited the planet prior to the last ice age. Because it got a little cold, they left our planet. But now, since we've warmed it up for them, they're back to evict us. One of the taglines in the manual is, "We have seen the aliens and they are us," implying that the humans are not actually from Earth in this game, but this isn't expanded upon in any of the documents I could find about Xevious. Anyways, the Xevions seem to be doing a pretty good job at taking over Earth and are happily making themselves at home. Humanity's last hope is the state-of-the-art Solvalu fighter. Your goal is to destroy the mothership of the Xevions, which will presumably lead to the collapse of their forces. Kind of like in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. One bit of lore that's not mentioned in the guides are the Nazca lines that are found in several parts of the game. I wonder if this is somehow related to the quote-unquote theories that aliens played a part in the creation of the Nazca lines, but I couldn't find anything to support or disprove that. There are 32 enemies in Xevious, which are split between ground and air units. Let's go through some of my favorites. The first flying enemies you encounter in the game are known as toroids. I love the design of these ships and how they take the flying saucer type ship and put a little spin on it by making it hollow. They're worth 30 points if you kill them, which isn't very much. These chaps are also kind of cowardly, darting toward the edge of the screen, away from your Solvalu. Sometimes, depending on their mood, they will fire off a single shot while retreating, but otherwise they are mostly harmless. I consider them to be some kind of scouting ship, but that's just based on vibes. Another flying enemy that is encountered early in the game is the Torcan. These guys remind me of TIE fighters. They swoop in, fire off a shot, and leave. They're pretty tame on their own, but they usually come in small groups, which can pose a challenge. The weirdest enemy, if you can call it an enemy, is the Bakura. These are basically just flying slabs of what might be concrete or metal. They move slowly toward you and cannot be killed. Honestly, that kind of sounds like an eldritch horror, except it's just a piece of sheet metal. Now, by far the largest enemy in the game is the Andor Genesis, which serves as the boss of the game. It appears at set intervals, blocking your progress until you either damage it or live long enough for it to get bored and leave. It shoots these cannonball-looking projectiles at you, which I find just so infuriating to dodge. I'll be honest, I'm not very good at shoot-'em-up games, so this guy usually kills me. In addition to the aerial enemies, there's also a lot of ground-based units that you use your bomber to destroy. You've got your pyramid buildings, both large and small. I like that you can blow off the top of the large pyramid. That's a really nice detail. You've got your circle and square buildings. The simple buildings usually come in pairs or groups of 4, and if you bomb the center between them, both of the buildings explode. There's also more advanced buildings, like the Oza Logram and the Garu Dorota, which can really catch you out with their superior firing rate. Additionally, there are moving ground units such as these octagonal tanks. As a kid, my shoot-'em-up game skill was certainly lacking, so encountering enemy types beyond the ones previously mentioned was a rare occurrence. These tougher late-game enemies were shrouded in mystery, and only seen when I somehow made it past the first mothership. Seeing one was like seeing an actual UFO. And honestly, whenever I saw one, I usually died because I would be too interested in the ship design to actually try to fight it. There are these alien T-shaped ships, these strange flying saucers with saw blade edges, and these ultra-fast energy orbs which rain down upon you without warning. Something I also learned from reading the guide is that in addition to ground and air enemies, there are also these underground enemies. If you bomb the right patch of ground, you can reveal another structure to destroy. According to Masanobu Endo, who led the design of the game, the concept for Xevious as a scrolling shooter game was handed to him by the marketing department of Namco. They wanted to compete with the other popular shooter games of the time, and it was his job to turn their vague idea into reality. The game went through several iterations, including one where the Solvalu was a helicopter. In addition to designing the game, Masanobu Endo did a great deal of the art for Xevious. For the time, Xevious had spectacular graphics, and can be especially lauded for how it created the illusion of 3 dimensions in enemies such as the Bakura. Masanobu Endo refers to the technique used in the creation of the sprites as ray tracing by hand rendering, which I find to be a fascinating term. Certainly, we would consider a great deal of this work basic pixel art skills today, But that just goes to show how far video games have come. Upon its release as an arcade game, Xevious was extremely successful in Japan, though it was less popular in the United States. Masanobu Endo, who was new to video game development when he made Xevious, went on to make many more video games, and even founded his own game studio, which he called Game Studio. Xevious itself went on to inspire many future games in the shoot-'em-up genre, and then it ended up on a plug-and-play console that my parents bought at Target. What a journey.